Welcome to the Learning Can't Wait podcast, a Full Mind production. At Full Mind, our vision is to ensure every child has access to an exceptional education. Each episode, we will be joined by pathfinders within and around the education space who are bringing about transformational change on behalf of deserving students. I am your host, Hayley Spira-Bauer. Welcome back, everybody, to the Learning Can't Wait podcast. We have an incredible guest on today to share her story, which I am using as a punny start to the conversation because we have Louise Baigelman, the founder and CEO of Storyshares. Louise, welcome.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
I'm so eager for you to talk about what you created in 2013 and why you created it and why you didn't do it sooner so that I could have used it as a teacher. But I am excited it exists now. Let's kick it off by starting with our first question. How did you come to be the personal and professional version of yourself?
Yeah, so I think where I am now has been formed by so many experiences and people and books along the way. For me, as a kid, I loved reading and writing, and I think those both a huge impact on both my experience with different contexts and perspectives and lenses and stories. And also just feeling connected to the power of books. And then when I was a teacher, my students, I think, really had a huge impact on forming me into the person I am, and also in starting Storyshares as a way to address the needs that I saw among them and that I felt needed solution, and that there was one possible if we could figure it out.
That's incredible. I know that your time in the classroom seems really impactful on what you've built. Tell us about Storyshares, why it's known as an approach to diverse and accessible libraries was the title from the EdTech Insiders podcast you did. Why did they name it that? And what are you building? Or what have you built, I should say?
Yeah, so Storyshares is focused on supporting adolescent literacy, providing pathways for older students who have not yet become proficient readers to learn to read, to be able to read well, and to learn to love to read. And that requires books that are both accessible and representative and relevant and engaging. And what's interesting about literacy instruction is that typically, traditionally, we teach students how to read in kindergarten through third grade. And we expect that by third grade, they've learned how to read, and they then can use reading to learn new things and to access the content in every other class and subject. But the reality is today, for many reasons, a huge number of students get past that third grade point without yet being strong readers. And but literacy instruction has stopped. And so for me, as a fifth grade teacher, I was working with multilingual learners and students who were 3, 4, 5 grade levels behind in reading. And I knew that I couldn't get them to improve their skills, to practice reading, to like reading, if I had to offer them the books that were written for first, second graders. So that was what inspired Storyshares. Is we have to be able to make a book that supports older students who are still learning to read without making them feel babyish and stigmatized. And so we set out to do that.
Louise, I know you know this because I just told you, but you and I have the same exact story about teaching fifth grade reading. And I shared this recently on LinkedIn that when I was hired to teach that fifth grade reading class, the person who hired me, Dr. Sam Bragamany, said to me, your job is to get kids to fall in love with reading. Because once you get kids to fall in love with reading, everything else happens.
Exactly. Love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you recently in a parents.com article said that reading for pleasure will always be relevant. And it speaks so much to my own philosophy about teaching kids to read and also creating lifelong love of reading. So I really connect with that. And I just wish you had created this tool when I was teaching fifth grade reading. Do you hear that a lot?
Yeah, well, it is amazing the number of teachers out there who are in classrooms, whether it's fifth grade, eighth grade, 11th grade, and have been doing so many things to try and fill the gaps to get their students to where they need to be. And who say, oh, I wish I could find books earlier that were made for my students and gave them choices that they could use to scaffold up their skills and to transform their relationship with reading and their experiences with reading.
I love that. And I think that it really speaks to this approach to personalized learning of making sure that you're not just meeting the academic needs of kids, but to me, StoryShares really fills the social and emotional piece as well. Like you wouldn't give a kid who broke their leg and needed a cast a pair of glasses,
Right.
right? So you have to approach teaching in the way that we approach kids and their individual interests and needs with the same care and attention that we do to so many other things.
Yeah, exactly. And I often talk about, some of the reason that we haven't more broadly started solving this literacy challenge for grades 3 and up is because it takes just a little shift in perspective. But I always say that so many of, if not most of, the core practices and strategies that go into teaching reading in the early grades, in first grade, second grade, are applicable to teaching reading in middle school or high school. But you have to marry them with the social emotional components that are present when it's a teenager learning to read, and all of the different associations they've already developed with reading and the things they love and care about and are inherently interested in. You have to bring those into play and marry those with, the best practices in literacy instruction. And then you actually can address it comprehensively.
You know, just to brag on you for a second, this is like a tool that's been around for over a decade. You and the tool itself have won multiple awards. You were named Forbes 30 Under 30, the International Library Association 30 Under 30. You've received awards from the Library of Congress, Teacher America, Milk and Pen GSE, Reimagine Education for your work with StoryShare. So first of all, congratulations. Like
Thank you.
these accolades are not as important as the impact I'm sure that teachers feel having your tools and having StoryShares in their hands, in their tool belt, but are still a huge testament to the importance of what you're building and what
Thank you.
you've built.
Thank
What
you.
I would ask you next is like, what's next? Like, what are you focused on right now to help bring StoryShares to the next level in impacting students and teachers?
Yeah, we have big plans for this next phase and for next year. 2024 was a really exciting year for us as far as growth and impact. We developed these decodable chapter books for older students where we played with the concept of, decodable books and structured literacy for those students still building their foundational skills, and knew that there are a huge gap as the science of reading has been sweeping through classrooms. And it actually started because I had a couple of conversations in a row where people said it would be impossible to make a decodable book that was engaging for a teenager. And so
You're like, I'll take that challenge.
yeah. Yeah, I couldn't get that out of my head. I was like, it doesn't feel like it's challenging, but it doesn't feel impossible. And so we batted around all these ideas and came up with the decodable chapter book, where we essentially anthologized these little decodable texts and made each one a chapter in a book that looks like a YA novel. And then we just used pretty simple concepts around, not cartoon line drawings, but photographs of middle schoolers and making the book, not a little bitty square, but something that feels like the books their peers are reading. And those have been really amazing for us. So we've developed 6 decodable chapter book series this year, and next year we have big plans to develop many more, including some knowledge building decodable texts that help provide practice and background knowledge and vocabulary across the different subject areas. So, climate change decodables or American history, because that's another big need we've heard. And then we had our first efficacy results where we did a pilot and were able to provide not just the books, but surrounding resources for educators, teacher coaching and training, and some, lesson plans, so a more comprehensive intervention program. And we were blown away by the results from that. So we're really going to take that to the next level next year to get a larger study that really proves out the effectiveness of this approach. And then we're trying to grow our reach, just make sure that the teachers and students who need these resources know that we exist and are able to find them.
Okay, this is a lot. So you're tackling the country's most media-friendly topic, which is decodable text, phonetics and phonemics and phonics learning for older kids, which Sold a Story, the podcast, did a deep dive on. We're seeing some parents in Massachusetts suing the original creator of the curriculum that Sold a Story was about. And you are like, you know what? I'm going to create a tool that tackles this known needed problem, which is older kids who did not learn to read in K3, which is what you said earlier, which is amazing. First of all, that is so cool. I'm dying to see a copy of one of these books, actually.
Yeah, I'll send you.
And then you kind of segued quickly into this efficacy study. Something important that I think as it relates to both the Sold a Story podcast, which is that, research tells us the curriculum that most American schools were using did not effectively address all learners to teach them to read. So you diving into an efficacy study, I think is important. One, to validate what you're doing today, but also two, to hit this like post-ESSER fund period that we're in right now, where the only things schools are buying are things that either have a ton of stickiness in their community or are proven to work. So as a fellow, almost like vendor in this space, I understand why an efficacy study would be important.
Yeah, exactly. There's a valuable emphasis on using research-based approaches and products and strategies, and not wanting to take on new things if we're not sure they actually work towards the impact that we're going for. And so we want to make sure that we are able to prove that out, but also be able to gather data that can help inform the next things we do and how to build it to really meet the needs of the students and teachers we are trying to serve.
I feel so silly sometimes because, not silly, but selfish, because when I talk about how badly I want research for every implementation at Full Mind, I always admit, like, hey, I'm also being selfish. Like, yes, I want to know how your kids are doing. I want to tweak the implementation, but I also just want to know what's working and what's not holistically so that we could be better for the partners we have, all the partners, not just you, but everybody. And I'm glad you called that out, because sometimes I feel like, does a school want to hear how selfish I am? I mean, it's ultimately selfless, but it feels selfish to be like, but I need this data too.
Right. No. Yeah, I think it is. It's part of being a learner too, right? It's not, you don't just want to do a research study for validation. I mean, of course, that's an important part, but also with the learner mindset, it is, how do I how do I understand the areas for growth? And I want negative feedback if it's out there so that I can address it.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine you have some really good stories from students who have used story shares. Are there any that you can think of to share with the audience here that feel particularly impactful?
Yeah, so we do hear amazing stories from, teachers and classrooms. One of the things we hear often is that students who had never finished a whole book and who just avoided reading, so in an independent reading period, for example, was doing anything they could to not actually sit down and read for obvious reasons because they didn't want to have to pick up, the Fluffy Bunny and read that in eighth grade, that those students, when they had StoryShares book choices as part of that independent reading time, they not only finished their first ever whole book, but they actually would nudge, their peers and say, you need to read this. And they would go back to their teacher and say, can I have another one like that? So those are always really inspiring because it shows the actual transformation, not just in I finished a book, but now I want to read another one. And then, yeah, one of the other stories that I love is a student who, even one step further, finished a book that had sort of a cliffhanger ending and was so desperate to find out what happened that he wrote his own sequel to the book. So that was even more, all the way around that cycle of literacy from a striving reader to becoming actually a writer.
Oh, I could picture this like so clearly in my head. I'm thinking of a few students who are now 25, by the way, and have their own kids, but like who I talk to regularly who would have really loved that and had those texts. I remember, I'll never forget, there was this graphic novel called Baby Mouse. It's still in libraries. It has like a pink cover, but it was like one of the only graphic novels with simplistic text that I was handing students because of their reading level. And the frustration, all they wanted to do was read, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, like the kid who could access Diary of a Wimpy Kid in fifth grade. But they couldn't.
Right.
Diary of a Kid is not a straight graphic novel. It has embedded paragraph within between the pictures. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah,
I love that. Louise, those are really powerful anecdotes that speak to not beyond the research, but the testament of creating that lifelong learner, getting kids to fall in love with reading. Reading unlocks so much for so many. And, to have the ability to choose what to read is a powerful choice.
absolutely. Yeah, choice for engagement, even alone, right, is opens a lot of doors for students. So absolutely.
Louise, I imagine you encounter like teachers who are rabid consumers of story shares that are just, trying to get their hands on it. You yourself have an education background. Are you working with the teachers as you develop the product to ensure that it is like fitting appropriately into their libraries? Like, tell me what part the teachers play in your product development.
That's a great question. It's one of the key pieces for me is, and for my team, is always keeping really closely in touch with teachers at every stage of development. It informs really how we make new content and also what we add to the suite of resources we have, because at every level, as we gather feedback, so we pilot, things from a new book series. When we first did our first decodable book series, we brought on about a dozen pilot classrooms where we wanted their very specific feedback on the books and what worked and didn't. And we got some great insights that completely informed the development of the second series. And so we try to take a very adaptive approach to the way that we make new content. I think it's one of the key ways that we've been able to grow, because we're not just we're not just saying, well, we know what everyone needs and we can make it perfectly. We're trying to acknowledge the importance of the shifting landscape, the variety of perspectives, and always get that feedback at every step, so that we don't just end up kind of, putting on blinders and making the thing we think we should make. So, our teacher community is really a big part of forming the ways that we develop content.
So my final question for you is just about those exact teachers: is what advice would you give a teacher, maybe a reading teacher, starting their career today?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things I would say for a reading teacher, and especially I'll say even a secondary reading teacher, is
do it.
Find that spark for the student, whatever it may be. What are they interested in? What do they love? What brings them alive? And use that as your hook and your kind of entry point to getting that student to love reading and to practice and to improve, because it could be anything. It could be the student loves cooking or skateboards, or they want to chat with you about their friends. Whatever it is, I think that like connection point is really what opens so many doors and helps to get over those barriers that come in from a skill perspective. So that would be my piece of advice.
Amazing. Louise, it is such a pleasure to meet you. I have loved learning more about Storyshares, and you can tell I'm a huge fan of what you're building and what you've already built. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing with the Learning Can't Wait audience.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was such a pleasure having you on and learning about Storyshares, and thank you to everybody who tuned in today. Thanks for listening to the Learning Can't Wait podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and share this episode. Be the first to know when we have a new episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or have a suggestion for an episode, email us at podcast@fullmindlearning.com.